On Wednesday, the Senate Finance Committee unanimously voted in favor of an amendment to discourage European participation in the boycott movement against Israel. Huffington Post reports, quote, "The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is a worldwide effort to cease business with Israel in protest of its occupation of the Palestinian territories. But while individuals in European countries may elect to participate in the movement, there is no institutional EU policy to boycott. While the language of the amendment does not directly specify punitive action toward countries that boycott Israel, the implication is that U.S.-EU free trade relations are conditional upon European countries abstaining from the BDS movement." So, in other words, we are bullying Europe and European nations to not stand up against occupation. But it gets worse, because it's not just occupation. Quote, "The Senate Committee's amendment specifically targets an EU decision to cut economic support for Israeli settlements." So do you get that? The U.S. isn't just saying to Europe that they must trade with Israel in general. They're saying you must trade even with the new settlements on freshly stolen land. Damn. That's a special kind of fucked up. Because look, while I don't agree with it, I can see an argument of, well, you know, what are you going to, don't punish the people in like the 1947 area territories. That just wouldn't make any sense. But they're not saying, they're saying don't do anything against them, don't do anything against people before the 67 borders, don't do anything to people in the brand new settlements that were just stolen. So now let's get to the embarrassingly stupid Chuck Schumer. He said in a committee hearing about this that it's, quote, "appalling that EU members boycott Israel, but not other countries in the region with poor human rights records. They just pick out Israel, even though Israel is a democracy and has far greater provisions for human rights and protections of all people than any of the surrounding countries do." So this is an argument that we've heard many times over in recent days. Essentially, the argument is, well, why would you single out Israel? Everybody else in the region is bad too. Well, wouldn't you want to hold Israel to a higher standard? And also, while I agree that those other issues are fucked up in the surrounding regions in the Middle Eastern countries, occupation is a different issue. So, yeah, I actually agree. I do think that we and Europe, we should all get together and say, let's not do any business with any nations that are just incredibly brutal and repressive and crazy and backwards on social issues. I agree with you, Chuck Schumer, but I also think we should do the same thing in terms of Israel for occupying Palestine. I do, because they've demonstrated time and time again they're not going to do it willingly. They're not going to go back to the 1967 borders willingly, right? And remember, we discussed how the Palestinian territories proposed a peace deal through Jordan at the UN, and the peace deal was very straightforward and very fair. They said, look, let's do 1967 borders, let's share Jerusalem, and let's iron out all the other details. We'll give ourselves a year or two to figure out all the specifics that are up in the air right now, and then you have whatever it is, 5 years or 6 years to actually implement this deal. You ready? Let's shake on it. Israel rejected it out of hand. So when you're faced with a situation where the actual area for a peace deal, the border for a peace deal, is just rejected out of hand, and they're not willing to have a conversation about it, where do you go from there? You have no other option but to do something like a boycott. And understand, for somebody like me, you know, me supporting a boycott is not an expression of like, I don't believe in Israel. It's an expression of, I want Israel to live in peace. I want there to be a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, and I want them to live in peace, relatively speaking, in the sense that you don't fight literally all the fucking time. You could build a giant fucking wall down the middle on the border, and you can make it so that you seep the venom out of the situation, and you can make it so that Israel, you could win every argument from there on out if you just did a peace deal and did a smart peace deal. Can you imagine if Israel said, okay, we're going to do the 1967 borders, let's do it right now. Split up Jerusalem, let's do it right now. And then they did it, and then there were still examples of extremists in Hamas attacking Israel. Do you understand how quickly the entire international community would come to the defense of Israel? They'd be like, dude, they did a peace deal. Now you have a Palestinian state. Now you're part of the International Criminal Court and the UN and all these things. And we're supposed to have peace now, but you guys attack them. Everybody would condemn. Across the board, everybody would say, you're in the wrong, Israel's in the right. But see, we're not at that point right now. We're at a point right now where Israel is saying no to the peace deal, and they're taking more territory and more settlements, and they don't want to do a peace deal. So, of course there should be a boycott and a divestment and sanctions. Of course there should be. Where else do you go to try to get a peace deal? Look, the idea is, well, you'd be hurting Israel too much. But you're hurting them in the short run to fix the problem in the long run. The people who wanted to do sanctions against apartheid South Africa, you could say, well, you're being anti-South African. But in the long run, it actually was the right thing to do because you brought South Africa to a place where there was more peace in the long run. So, look, it's just a silly argument to say, well, the other Arab nations do really fucked up shit and they're anti-gay and they're anti-woman, so then don't look at any of the wrong things that Israel does. No, look at the wrong things that everybody does. I would stop doing business deals with Saudi Arabia immediately if I could. I would make it so that, all the oil we produce here, and we produce a lot of it, I would just have us consume that oil and stop depending on Middle East oil. I don't want to do, trade deals with horrifically repressive governments. I agree on that point. But I also wouldn't want to do them with a government that's doing an occupation and they're brazen about what they're doing. And then you ready for the cherry on top here? Senator Ron Wyden, who's a Democrat, who on some issues is good, so that's why this is even more heartbreaking. He said this about this proposal, quote, "As the son of parents who fled Nazi Germany in the 30s, I have been troubled by the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and around the world. We shouldn't let American trade policy be used in any kind of fashion that would in some ways show a tolerance for that kind of anti-Semitism." That's just a flat-out disingenuous bullshit argument. You're not going to get any disagreement on, hey, anti-Semitism is on the rise in Europe. Yes, it is, and that's fucked up, and that's wrong, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism in this world that we live in, for sure. But you know what's not anti-Semitism? This movement. This movement is to stop occupation and get a Palestinian state. Period. It wouldn't matter if it was Bangladeshis preventing a Palestinian state. It wouldn't matter if it was Jamaicans preventing a Palestinian state. It wouldn't matter if they were Jewish or Buddhist or from Mars. The fact of the matter is, as of right now, Israel is preventing a Palestinian state from existing. So when people say, let's boycott and divest and do sanctions to try to get a Palestinian state to exist, that's not anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitic is irrational hatred of Jews. And what we're talking about here is not a hatred of Jews in any way, shape, or form. It's an attempt to get lasting peace in the region by stopping the occupation. But see, that's the trump card right there. You pull that out and then nobody can disagree with you or they're immediately an anti-Semite, which is horrendous because you're diverting. You don't want to have a conversation about the actual issue at hand because you know you'll lose in that conversation.